can't say I'm responsible, but thanks for coming. I want to show you briefly an outline of the things that I want to talk about in my talk here. So first I want to talk about America's best idea and how it starts to spread around the world. And then we're going to talk about the geologic history, right? We all have questions. We've seen these glaciers, mountains, all this water around us now. Things are always changing. And we'll talk a little bit about the European explorers that came here. And then that fella, John Muir, or John Muir. Did I get a little applause for John Muir? Did I hear that? Yes! We have to thank him for Glacier Bay and making it on the world's, newspaper headlines in his time. Then we talk about the Antiquities Act of 1906, which really helped us create national monuments. I'm going to talk about Glacier Bay being created in 1925, and then how it became a national park in 1980. And now it's a UNESCO World Heritage Preserve. But I got a question for you folks. So who knows about America's best idea, right? We've got lots of fans of national parks. Who can tell me what was the first national park ever?
Yellowstone.
I hear two Y's. I hear some Yellowstone. I heard some Yosemite. Actually, it's neither of those. It's not technically, well, it's a national park now, but at the time they didn't call it a national park. But in 1832, long before they got around to preserving Yellowstone or Yosemite, the U.S. Congress made laws to set aside this parcel of land at Hot Springs Reservation. And they did it to protect the hot water. That water was considered healing water by the locals. And I love to drive through here when I'm going cross country, and I'll get my water jugs filled up, and you'll see all the locals. They look like they're 50 and they're 88, and they'll tell you that that water keeps them young. And they'll be filling up 5-gallon or 20-liter jugs in the back of their trucks. Nowadays, there is no longer a streetcars there. You can walk along that street, but these buildings are still preserved, and it's a fantastic place. And the idea was that water, that hot water that the people drink, that they would bathe in, they wanted to preserve it for everyone. No one company could come in there and control that resource. And to this day, you can fill up your bottles for free. So this idea is kicking around about preserving things in America. So what was the next national park? I heard some of you. Still not Yellowstone, right? It's Yosemite. That's right. Yosemite in 1864, while all the hubbub was going on with the middle of the Civil War, they still found time to set aside land for preservation and recreation. And so it was President Lincoln who set aside the Yosemite Grant in 1864. And this was set aside so that people could use it for recreation and for the public use, so it was not belong to anybody. I put up here a slide from the Yosemite Valley, 1855, by a contemporary artist, Thomas Ayers. And you know what's really amazing, one of the gifts of national parks, anybody been to Yosemite? I haven't been there yet. I saw it once from an airplane. It looked like a perfect postage stamp. But if you go today, it's going to look pretty much the same as it did in 1855. Right? Looks like there's a mule or a horse in the front there. I'm sure there's maybe a few cars going in, but the idea of these national parks is we've preserved them so that people can enjoy them 150 years later, 170 years later. You can still go to Yosemite. Somebody in the back, check seems like the projector's kind of bouncing a little, or did the ship go over a wake? You guys keep an eye on that. Let's see here. So we don't really talk about Yellowstone as a national park until this group of folks had gone to explore it. All right? Take it to 1871. This group represents the Hayden Geologic Survey. Now, there was a mountain man, Jim Bridger. Anybody been to Yellowstone?
Yeah.
All right, I got to work there 3 years ago. I used to drive the yellow buses, so if I look familiar, maybe I drove you around Yellowstone 3 years ago. And they would tell stories about mountain man Jim Bridger. He would tell stories about pools of water, hot enough to boil fish, right? And other pools of water that would throw themselves up in the air like a 10-story building. And everyone thought mountain man Jim Bridger was crazy, that he'd been spending too much time alone out in the woods. But he had convinced a few luminary folks like Hayden to come out and investigate these claims. And the Hayden expedition actually hired mountain man Jim Bridger to lead them. And they brought with them map makers, engineers, mineral explorers, and botanists and biologists. But they also brought along a couple characters I want to point out to you. This character was along the Hayden expedition, and his name is Thomas Moran. And this was the painter who was brought on board, okay? And his job was to capture the visual, stunning imagery to bring back for this campaign of exploration and potentially make it into a park. And here's one of his creations. Pretty nice, right? A view of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. Well, also along was a photographer. Photography was in its early stages. This character is William Henry Jackson, and he was the expedition photographer. Now, they didn't have instant digital cameras, right? But they did have instant photography back then. This character was using collodion, which he had to make his own film while he was out in the woods. He had his own assistant, his own mule team, and a tent that they would set up. He would make the film on big sheets of 11 by 14 or 20 by 24 inch sheets of glass or plate metal. He had to put it in the camera while the chemicals were still wet, take a photograph, and then develop it in the field. And here's the kind of images that he brought back. So the same place, that Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, and here's his photograph of that. Well, these guys got back to Washington later on, and Thomas Moran went into his studio and created one of his masterpieces that was influential in convincing President Ulysses Grant to sign the act of dedication that created Yellowstone National Park. So this was done in 1872, and it was paintings like this masterpiece that was displayed in Washington, and these influential campaigners said, let us preserve this land for everyone. So now we're using the term national park, and this is what some authors have referred to as America's best idea. Jasper were originally called Rocky Mountain National Park, and I don't know if they changed the name when we decided to have a Rocky Mountain National Park, but now they're called Banff and Jasper, and that is the third national park that was created. And then the idea started to take off around the world. We want to have areas where people can explore, hike in wilderness, relax the mind from the stresses of the modern world, which was starting to pave the planet back in the 1800s, right? And so New Zealand has set up all sorts of national parks. And then over in Europe, Sweden was the first country to establish national parks. And 9 national parks over in Sweden. In South America, it was Argentina that picked up the torch and decided they had areas to preserve. And then we have parks in Germany. And now in Europe, there's over 319 national park units that are protected. And so we even have national parks in Japan, so that you have places where you can get away from city life, breathe the fresh air. You know, I think you might have heard Patrick say earlier today, we were 65 miles from the nearest road. 65 miles. The air here is probably the cleanest air you're ever going to breathe. So when you get back outside, 1,000 years ago, all of North America was covered with ice. And so this represents Glacier Bay. This very faint outline here is the modern park boundaries. So think about that while I go through these. These little colored spots are the mountain peaks sticking up above the glaciers. That's called a nunatak, right? Nunatak, there's a fun word to have for you. And some of you noticed that when the glacier wraps around a mountain. And so completely covered most of North America, down through the Midwest and across the Northeast, all of Europe. Then that melted, and around 14,000 years ago, this area was a bay. But it didn't stay like that, because if there's one thing about Glacier Bay you can count on, it's going to change. It's going to change in time. And so we started to have colder periods, and the glacier, the Grand Pacific Glacier, started to form and create this very glaciated land. I don't know how his wife felt about this, but a year later, they sent him back out again on the third voyage. He didn't get home very much. And unfortunately, on his third voyage was his last and final voyage. He ran into some trouble in Hawaii. And so when you see the blue line, that represents the crew returning without their captain. But before that, he made his way here to Glacier Bay. This is why I bring up James Cook. On his third voyage, you can see he went up through the Bering Straits and he cruised along the coast of Alaska. And it was James Cook was the first European to spot Mount Fairweather. Mount Fairweather is the highest peak around here, 15,000 and some hundred feet. And it happened to be one of these clear days when he spotted it and gave it the name Fairweather, because usually it's socked in by clouds and we don't really get to see it. Now, along with Captain Cook was another young, capable lieutenant who came back later under his own command. Some of you may have heard of this folks, George Vancouver. So George Vancouver gets the mission to go and explore and map the Northwest Passage to Asia. And he comes along here to where we are now in Glacier Bay. In 1794, they send out a mapping team. Remember I said 1750, that ice had come all the way out here? We know that from the geologic evidence. These folks made a map, and there was a 5-mile indent into that 1,000-foot wall. So just 50 years later, the ice had started to recede. And that was the map that they brought back. And then aside from the natives living around here and some Russian fur traders, not a lot of European activity comes around this area. We don't have anybody come back up here to talk about Glacier Bay to the rest of the world until our favorite John Muir. John Muir comes up here because he has a fantastic idea. I got a little time to talk about John Muir. He nearly lost his eye. He had a file jam into his eye in an industrial accident, and by some...
The boat come to pick up a pound Ranger.
Em nghĩ cruise ship thì hay buffet for.
Đương nhiên rồi. They pick up Ranger and now they go back to the park.
Nữa hả? Đi cái thuyền lớn không sòng sành, chứ mấy thuyền nhỏ không sành theo được. Đau.
Today is June 26, 2018. We are on the way to College York. This is the last day of the cruise ship. 7 days, so now upset on the sky now. Okay.
They said
Well. Oh, that's ship.
yeah, con nhỏ bé nha, con nhỏ bé nè. Well, sao vậy? Yes, two of them.
Well.
Yeah, two of them.
Yeah, between us and the ship.
Frankie, get away. Yeah. Sáng quên kinh của mẹo. The deal is when you saw it, you yell. Ồ, nó sắp sửa đưa cái lưng lên nha ba nha. I'm gonna flip the tail. Okay. See, I told you more mà này.
It's an army. And what do we want to say? Do you have a wife? Are you married? Yes. How many of you have? One. Wait. Is it allowed to marry 2 wives in the Philippines? Really? Oh, now don't put yourself in trouble now.
That's right,
Only one. Yes. Do you have any kids?
Yes.
How many? 3 kids. Okay.
All boy.
All boys. Okay. All boys. Is anyone going to become a chef?
Yes, the youngest one.
Oh, okay. So he's going to come on the cruise ships eventually, or?
I don't think so.
Now you're doing all the coating here. You put all this stuff right on.
Blood, connective tissue, and then where the uses of meat, fertilizer, and dog food, and animal feed not really necessary. They only eaten in Iceland, Norway, Korea, and Japan. Okay, more interesting, the behavior. behavior scientists are always trying to understand what they're observing, what does that mean in any animal species, and trying to put those observations to some rhyme or reason. So this is a good shot to show the tubercles that I was talking about to that. And theirs is going to be about 6 to 7 minutes if they're just swimming along, not feeding or not being chased by a predator. But this is how often you'd expect to see them rise up. Now the calves are going to come up a little more often. They have to breathe a little more often. Newborn and the young calves are often helped to the surface. Mom gives them a bump from underneath until their musculature really develops, and so that's a good thing for them. I'll show you some photos of that. And then the adults may submerge for about 30 minutes. That's a pretty average time for most whales. Not the longest time. Sperm whales can go down for over 2 hours and dive much deeper, but 30 minutes is a pretty good dive for the humpback. They have 2 nostrils, and the shot right here gives you a look at the nostrils, so that's a pretty good photo. And they have obviously been well adapted to the marine life. They have a high gas exchange rate, about 90% of the oxygen that's absorbed through their lungs into the bloodstream. And to relate that, humans have about a 20% absorption rate, so they do a pretty good job of using the air that they're getting. Okay, looking at the blow, this is the first thing we recognize. Scanning the horizon, and you'll see a blow. Unless you're really close to the whale, and you see the whale's back come up first, or at the same time. So this one up in the upper left hand, we can see it's a Hawaiian whale, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's got this blow coming out. And the blow is really just water that's sitting on top of the blowhole as they come to the surface, so they're blowing that out of the way so that they can inhale. And so it's not in the lungs. This is something that's just water resting on top of them as they're just coming to the surface and they blow it out. Not often, but sometimes have a submerged exhale, and that can be used as communication. We call that trumpeting sometimes, just to show a dominance. And they also use it in feeding, and I'm going to show you that as well. So a couple of shots up here in Alaska, what it might look like, the weather that we're looking at today. Nice, pretty calm seas, and you look out and you're going to see a blow like that. Everybody see that?
Yeah.
It's pretty easy to spot. Little chop here. Look at this chart. On the left-hand side and down that column, we see the species of all the different whales, and then across the top here, categorized it into blow, the surfacing, what they look like diving, and then any other characteristics. And so our particular whale, the humpback, sits here first with a pretty big blow, one of the biggest that you might see, 15 to 20 feet when they come up. So it's a nice to recognize that by just its bulbous shape and height back. Now, other characteristics, a very unique looking flukes to their tail, and we'll get some different coloration on that as well to identify individuals. And lastly, I mentioned the pectoral fin is very unique looking, the longest out of all the whales, so again, pretty easy to recognize. Down below, at the very bottom, is the orca. We've included that in the chart as well. You can see orca has a pretty good blow. Usually they're really coming out of the water when they come to surface. They have a really tall dorsal fin. The male's dorsal fin can be up to 6 feet tall, and a very distinct pattern, a white-black pattern. I'll show you more about that when we get a little further along. Okay, breaching. Some of you, well, first of all, let me just survey. How many of you on this voyage have seen a humpback whale? Oh, that's good. Very many of you. Oh, well, I'm finished here then. Let's continue on. All right, breaching, a full body exit out of the water. So this is amazing, a tremendous amount of force here, as you can tell, coming up. This is a 35 to 40 ton animal to get all the way out of the water. And we get some interesting other things off this photograph. You can see his pectoral fins here are white. You got some barnacles that are attached to it, and barnacles and other parasites underneath the chin, as I mentioned, that are visible from this. Researchers, when they're around and they see breaching going on, this is good for them, because typically what's happening, the animal is sloughing off some skin. Whether or not they're doing that on purpose, it might be one of the reasons, trying to rid themselves of parasite. It's a big body slam. Or just, again, dominance. It might just be some fun activity just coming out of the water. But at any rate, when some of the skin sloughs off, and researchers are able to gather that up, they can do some forensic testing on it, DNA, and also determine the sex of the animal. I put this guy up here for those of you actually who live in the southern hemisphere. Any Aussies out there? not many, it's quiet.
Wow,
But this is a hypopigmented humpback that lives around Australia and New Zealand's been sighted down there. There's actually two of them. They call Migaloo and Migaloo Junior. So this is not a photoshopped photo here. This is an actual humpback. That's pretty neat. Okay, another behavior here is called lobtailing, or pretty neat to see. So tremendous amount of energy just to keep in that position. Again, what the reason is this is happening, not really sure, but it could be a show of dominance or just communication. Pectoral fin slap, another one. Well, this one's sort of sailing along here, but they do the same thing with their pectoral fins, slapping it on the surface. Seen this happen in occasion in rough weather where a calf might be more separated from a cow further than she wants to be, and she come to the surface and kind of slap the pectoral fin to call Junior a little closer. And I do this when I'm kayaking downwind, and I put my paddle up and catch the wind. I don't know, anybody do that? Sticking the hand out the car a little bit? Yeah, sure. It's fun. That's what we might be seeing here too. Just a fun activity. Planking, I just added this one recently.
Wow.
Kind of a college activity of fun for students to go out and lay out and take a photograph of themselves and send that home. Look, Mom, I'm planking. So I think the whales do it too. I'm not sure about that. How about this one, logging? Anybody know what this one happens? What's happening here? Shout it out. What do you think's going on? I see it every once in a while in the Princess Theater during lectures.
Sleeping.
Now you know, don't you? Yeah, yeah, they're sleeping. So what happens with the whales, they're able to actually close down half of their brain at one time. They sort of reboot, but they're still in an awareness mode, and then they do like to stay in small groups like that. Have to be at the surface, obviously, because they're breathing air all the time, and so because of that, they can still keep attention to any predators that might be moving in, but closing off half their brain kind of gives them the rest that they need, and off they go after a while. Logging. Let's try it. Here's another one, spy hopping. You may have seen this activity. Now, again, from their ancestral beginnings, these were land animals who had developed very good eyesight on land, and back in the marine world, they have good eyesight in water as well. And so sometimes you'll see them push up like this, doing a dolphin kick. That's what swimmers would call it, but they prefer to call it a whale kick, to kind of keep them up at the surface and balance there, so you get a better look at something. And so their eyesight is good enough above the water line to actually give them a good clear view of something. Now I want to point out the coloration on this one. We saw that previous slide where that whale was nearly all black, and this one's showing kind of white ventral underneath the belly and the pectoral fins. And this is typical of many species that we see in the marine world. It's called contour shading, and it gives us a white underneath and a black back. And this is really to avoid predation. So when you're looking at something from down below and looking up, and they kind of meld in with the sun that's coming in through the surface of the ocean. And just the opposite happens if you're above that animal and looking down into the depths of the ocean. That black color helps them meld into the deep, dark ocean. So we see that in birds, in whales, in fish, just about anything you might find in the marine world. You get this contour shading, and so notice that when you're out looking at things, you'll often see black-white pattern here that shows us that. Now, whales. Main predator is the orca, and typically they make their attacks from underneath. That's the ventral is where more of the prime organs there are located a little closer to the ventral surface, so they're coming from underneath and making their attacks. And so they typically like to stay in shallower water that way to kind of protect themselves. Let's look at feeding. This is happening now up here in North Pacific, the feeding grounds, and
krill, okay. Not krill.
What do they feed on? Crustaceans, krill, and small fish, up to 3,000 pounds a day. So they're kind of in a ravishing state here because they haven't eaten while they're down in Hawaii. So when they're more subtropical locations, just like bears that go into hibernation, they're not eating. And so by the time they get up to these feeding grounds, they really need to eat fast and a lot and put on some weight. They swim in swarms of prey. This is one of their types of feeding called lunge feeding. And so they'll concentrate prey and then move quickly towards it, mouth agape, and gobble that up. And another type of feeding is where they concentrate prey in what's called a bubble net. They do this submerged exhale that I mentioned. So one will circle around the prey. It's a communal type effort, and exhale. And as those bubbles start to rise, the prey stays within those bubbles and doesn't push through them, just in a kind of a frenzied, scared moment, and comes all the way to the surface. The whales come up after it and follow it. Anybody see bubble net feeding before? A few of you? Yep, it's kind of neat. So on the surface, this is what it looks like, just as the bubbles arrive. Then slightly moment later, the whales arrive, and it's picnic time.
Oh, man.
Pretty neat to see. Okay, diving. Some of the characteristics they have in diving, their adaptions here, they're able to shunt blood from their non-vital organs when they're diving, from their stomach and kidneys, and move it to things that are more necessary, obviously, the brain, heart, and muscles to move it, especially if they're being chased by a predator. They can also slow their heartbeat when diving. And I talked about the timing for diving, or for swimming, about 6 to 7 minutes, the normal breathing period. And when we see their flukes up on the tail like that, we know that it's a steeper dive and they're going deeper and typically longer, so that could be up to 30 minutes. So when you're watching them swim and you're just seeing them blow, and then they're going to submerge a little bit and then come up in anywhere from 3 to 7 minutes, that happens again, you're fine, you're in the normal pattern, but once you see them put their tail up, they've taken that steep dive and they're going to be down longer, so mark your clock there. There he is underwater. Okay, so just put a little series of photos here together just to show you their humpback dive. There's the look of that dorsal fin right on the arch of the back.
Oh,
And he's going down for a little longer time. All right, the migration, I mentioned that they're up here from Hawaii, one group at least, but we see them that feed the North Pacific coastal waters all the way from Vancouver to the Bering Sea, and they're distributed in 3 general groups here from this North Pacific group that go over to off the Sea of Japan and over to winter area in off Mexico as well. The fastest migration that has been clocked from Hawaii to the Alaskan waters was from a cow and calf that did it in just 36 days. That's 2,500 miles, and that was 70 miles an hour for, 70 miles a day rather, to move. Miles an hour would be a little faster. During winter, they breed, as I mentioned, in Asia, Hawaii, and Mexico, and the females with calves will often have a male escort that comes along with them, a little bit of protection there. But in general, they're moving in this sort of arrival and departure order, and this data was actually collected from whalers in the past. So the arrival of females with yearlings, immature whales, mature females, mature males, and females in late pregnancy, and departure, mature females, immature whales, mature males, and then new mothers. And I've mentioned that in a previous talk, that often we find in nature that that many animals kind of stay separate by sex, and so they travel this way as well, the whales do. All right, where are they seen in Alaska? This is what the Coral Princess is doing this year up in Alaska, so you have a northbound and a southbound, and I put it up here because everywhere along this voyage we're apt to see whales. We're just coming into the Prince William Sound area, and that is also a real good area for whales, so we're going to come through Kitchen Brook Peninsula here in a bit and pass into even calmer waters, and through here is good sighting for humpbacks and orcas and sea otters, and you'll see them all the way up through College Fjord potentially. Okay, where are they seen in Hawaii? Has anybody been to Hawaii and looking at humpbacks? Good, a bunch of you. Yep, absolutely. So the real sweet spot here, this darkened area for the color code, is around Molokai and Lanai and Kaho'olawe and Maui. So through that area you can often see whales, and you can just sit on the beach and have a Mai Tai and watch whales bouncing around out there. You'll see around each of these islands too, there's some dashed areas that's a national marine sanctuary around each of these islands, and there's also possibilities around any of the islands to see humpbacks. They love Hawaii. Who doesn't? All right, their offspring. You can see, as I mentioned, that junior is often helped to the surface, especially newborns, to help them get up easier and catch a breath. They have to breathe a little more often. They like to ride in the slipstream here of the cow, and it's very much like drafting in NASCAR, getting behind the leader and cutting down on your wind resistance, and so that's a good spot for them. It's also, again, more protection because the attacks come from down below, and they don't want junior to be the first thing attacked, so that's a little protective area. All right, raising offspring. Lifespan, in general, they're still saying about 40 to 50 years, but really the more they learn about whales, the longer that lifespan gets. The longest lived whale right now that has a record was a bowhead whale that was taken by First Nations people just a couple years ago. And they had found, once they brought it up on shore, that it actually had an old harpoon in it. And from that harpoon that was broken off, it survived. It wasn't a fatal strike, obviously. They dated the harpoon to the 1800s, and so that whale was 130 years old when they took it. Yeah, could have lived longer. So we don't know. Sexual maturity, they reach age 5 to 9. They may give birth and raise young in Hawaii, so that's sort of the Las Vegas of the humpback world down there. So the Hawaiian waters are warm and clear and protected, a little shallower as well. So again, they're looking at having that protection of less water underneath them to avoid attacks from marauding orca. Gestation period lasts from 11 to 11 and a half months. The birth rate, one calf every 2 to 3 years, so it's not a very high birth rate. The newborn calves can weigh 1 ton and measure 14 feet. That's right out of the get-go. That's big. Often assisted to the surface, as I mentioned. Mother's milk is close to 40% milk fat, and that's typical for marine mammals, pinnipeds, and cetaceans that have a high fat content. They put on a lot of weight very quickly and help the growth rate very quickly, so that's very rich milk. And the calves will consume up to 100 gallons per day.
Wow.
That's a lot of eating.
100 gallons.
But they can actually gain anywhere from 7 to 10 pounds every hour. It's like a cruise every hour. Let's see when you get home.
Wow.
Singing. The humpback whale is famous for songs. They've even had records made out of it. Anybody ever hear humpback singing? It's pretty neat. Yeah, it's really neat. The function's not clear. Why they're doing it. Most likely territorial behavior, courting. Only the males sing, so we don't get that soprano level, just the bass. They can be heard over long distances. We know low frequency can travel in the ocean, even intra-ocean. There's a low frequency zone in our oceans, and sound has been recorded between oceans. Isn't that interesting? I put Chewbacca up here. I don't know if you know the background story on Star Wars, but when they were trying to put a voice together for him, they chose some marine mammals and pinnipeds and cetaceans, so that's sort of the mix of what makes up his voice, though there's only a few people who can understand it, right? Threats. What are the threats? Well, the predator at the apex of the marine world is the orca. Most people think it's the shark, but orca actually eat shark, so the orca is the one that's feeding on whales. Fight or flight, they get into a fight or flight mode as most prey does. So we look at different species and how they react to it. Some of them will try to swim away as fast as they can. I'll show you a chart here on some of the activities they do when a predator is in the area, and others get a bit more defensive, and some get extremely passive and just sort of give up when the orcas move in on them. So most of the species that we see on the planet are always in protection for their young, and that's typical just to continue the survival of the species. And so we see that with the nets that still entangle things. And I mentioned to people that just before I came up here in May, there was a gray whale that was caught in a fishing net just off of Seattle, and the Coast Guard was out there trying to cut that one loose. Effort to reinstitute whaling, obviously a threat. That would not be good for the species. And then climate change, well, it affects us all.
Oh, yeah.
Look at ocean circulation, how that's changing, and temperature of the ocean as it's warming up, and that has a big impact on prey. So certainly when you impact something's food source, it's going to be detrimental to to the species. Heavy metal concentration in the diet that we see in fish, it's especially taken a role for the orca, those that are resident orcas along Vancouver and up into Alaska. They found the higher concentration that is compounded as you go up the food chain there has not only impacted the young orca, but now they're seeing effects on the adults as well. So a little bit more about the orca. You can see it's revered by the native population in totems here, and also hung in certain shops around the ports. Some information on it.
Killer whale.
The name killer whale comes from, again, the whaling group that saw the attacks happening on whales as they were out also attacking whales. There's three typical groups, or general groups, that we might divide the orca whale population into, and that is a resident group and a transient group and an offshore group. The resident group is basically a fish eater that stays close to the shore. The transient group is one that moves into slightly deeper water and has added things like seals and sea lions and otters to its diet, as well as the fish. And the offshore group is the one that would be attacking whales. You can see the size of these things, up to 32 feet, 8 to 10 tons. How many of you seen orca on this trip? Good, that's good sighting. Yeah, and again, we're coming into an area that you may have an opportunity to see orca too. I mentioned that the size here and the coloration. Again, you see even in this predator, the apex predator has this contour shading. So we have a white ventral area and black dorsal, and very recognizable white patch right behind the eye. Of course, the tall dorsal fin, once they come to the surface, is a pretty good giveaway that you're seeing an orca. There's the white patch in the close-up. And I mention this because some people have seen these black and white marine mammals kind of going along the ship with us on our voyage, and these are Dall's porpoises, and can only be confused because of the coloration. And when you look a little closer, they don't have the exact, obviously, coloration as the orca does. But they're also very much smaller. They're only about 8 to 10 feet. You'll often see them just racing along the ship. They like to motor along with the ship, as a lot of dolphins and porpoise do, and they'll kick up these big rooster tails behind them. So that's the Dall's porpoise, named after William Dall, a great naturalist. And this is taken just, I went up to deck 15 and just shot this over the side of the ship, and you can see this rooster tail that comes up. But you see this black and white pattern down there, and you think you're seeing an orca, but now you know better. All right. So we talked about the threats and confrontation with the predator, and what are the observations we have here. So above the line here, the red line, we see just before an attack, so we've got an approach, swimming towards a baleen whale, and with or without an indication of any predatory intent. What happens? The chase, pursuit of a fleeing baleen whale, harassment, they're swimming closely, they may make some rushes towards it and feinting some attacks, just to sort of test the strength of the whale, see if it's an older whale or an injured whale that they're moving in on, very much like a lion might do in a pack of wildebeest. And then an attack, a predator interaction with a baleen whale involves contact. Below that line, what happens? What is the whale actually doing to this confrontation? Well, avoiding, obviously, first of all, moving away from an approaching orca, but not necessarily at high speed. So they're just changing their course to kind of move out of the direction of the way this orca might be coming on. A flee or flight moment, high speed swimming away. Most whales don't have a real high speed to move at. Orca can move fast for a short period of time, kind of like a cheetah. So they can typically move in very quickly on whales, but not over a long distance. Hiding, often used by many whale species. They move into some place of refuge like kelp beds or shallow water, again, trying to keep that attack from below, not allowing that to happen, and then sea ice as well, with some species that are up in higher latitudes. Stranding themselves, they'll get to the point where they'd rather just beach themselves than be attacked by a whale. I guess we feel the same way if a pack of wolves were on us, right? Thinking about what would you do? And then group communal effort here, formation of a tight group to kind of retreat back and give more formidable resistance to attacking orcas. And then lastly, defending themselves. And we might get to a point where some species actually get into defense of attacking back on the orca and certainly defending the calf. What is the humpback's response? Well, they've been seen to really get physical with the orcas, slashing tail flukes and at the predators. They've also rolled and thrash around and head shake and pectoral fin slaps. They've seen orca kill by pectoral fins of humpbacks in the past. Loud wheezing exhaltation, these trumpet blows I mentioned, so it might not seem like much coming from a human, but if you're a 40-ton animal, making a big noise might be enough to push an orca off. And then, as I mentioned, kind of positioning these calves into places where they're a little more protected zones. Having these males that come along as escorts also may keep orcas at bay as well. 40% of the calves still show wounds from orca teeth, so they still get in there and they still make contact, but there are survivors. I mentioned identification and research and using the flukes as identifying individuals, and so we've been doing this since the 1960s. Photography has been a great boon to all animal scientists, and so you can see the identification of individuals. These are all humpback tails, and from top left solid white to the bottom right solid black, and all variations in between, and scarring that they pick up year after year. So this is a fingerprint for each individual, and thousands have been cataloged like this in the humpbacks through the years, so it's a good way to keep track of them. Okay, other research and behavioral investigations continue, trying to figure out when we see what they're doing, trying to understand what it is, what the reason is that they're doing that. Doing DNA mapping, as I mentioned before, calf mortality studies. They are with all species, trying to understand what has taken the young ones before they reach adulthood, and migration patterns, getting more specific on the exact way they're swimming back and forth to feeding grounds, and birthing. There's never been a photograph of a live birth of a humpback whale. So now you know where that happens. So get your snorkel gear and a camera, head to Hawaii, and you get in the textbooks if you get a photograph of that. All right, that's all I have for today. That's the wave goodbye. I hope you enjoyed it.
All right, George.
Many folks are even a little bit startled when they first hear it. It makes an incredible impact. The native peoples here, the Tlingit peoples who have lived here for many, many centuries, they had a term for calving. They called it white thunder.
So I came here just out of chance and out of luck as an intern, and I was graciously invited to come back again. So during the winter time, the waterfall will slow down just because of the colder climate and temperatures. But as the summer progresses, more snow melt happens and more rainfall will occur, and therefore it's a stronger amount of flow and more impressive, and it draws visitors to the waterfall. So the accessibility about Juneau is why I enjoy coming back here. You're able to bike for 30 minutes and go to an ocean. You're able to walk.
Không, đi ra ngoài coi chứ anh. Thì đi ra ngoài chứ rồi coi để nó không để nó không.
very sharp teeth and very poor manners. And in the back, we've got the puppies that I will be passing out. Another rule about puppies, I do count before and after you guys leave.
just recently switched ownership, and it's basically just evolved into this really neat place for people to come and visit. It's out in the middle of nowhere, and it has the museum and the dogs, and it's great for Michelle because I think if this wasn't here, her mushing adventures would be a lot more difficult. So it's nice because she lives in Tagish right next to here. So yeah. Skagway wasn't a native town. Both the White Pass Trail and the Chilkoot Trail were native trails that they would go to Skagway and get fish and things like that, and then bring it up the trails and trade with the natives that were further inland. So Carcross is really that native town, and that's where Skookum Jim lived and died. And he was basically helped William Moore map out the White Pass Trail. Basically, William Moore was the founder of Skagway, and he came here wanting to build a road on the White Pass Trail. Basically, they were still working on the trail when the news of the gold rush hit, and so then thousands of people were going up the trail, and they weren't able to build the road. And then they realized that was going to cost them a lot more money, so William Moore basically got a bunch of people to put in money to build the train, and the train was built in 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. Time in 1982, they were being an Anvil mine was using them, and then they decided it was cheaper to ship through the trucks, and so they started doing that, and the train closed down. And then in 1988 it opened up again, because the town was basically like, we still have hundreds of thousands of people coming here for tourism, and the train has been open ever since then. And so basically Skagway probably wouldn't really exist if the tracks had never been built. glaciers. There's lots of glaciers that you can see actually from the tracks while you're on the train. And then on top of it, the train has all of its original train cars. So, and you can also take the steam train, which is one of the original steam engines. So it has a lot of history with it. And so that's the real beauty of it. And it goes by the trains. It's the same track that was, from the gold rush. So 1900. So it's kind of cool in that. And the train cars are definitely different as far as the insides, but you can go out on the ends of the train